Sarah Collins was the kind of woman who seemed to carry light wherever she went. Born in the early 1990s in the quiet town of Ashford, tucked in the northwestern corner of England, she was raised in a loving but disciplined household. Her mother, Margaret Collins, was a civil servant who lived by rules and order, while her father, Thomas Collins, worked as an agricultural engineer, spending his days among soil and machines. Sarah had two siblings, Violet, the eldest, and Andrew, the youngest. She was the middle child, a position that often makes people either lost in the shadows or shining brighter to be seen. Sarah chose the latter. From her early school days, she showed an unusual brilliance and creativity. Teachers remembered her as the girl who stayed behind after class, doodling sketches and crafting ideas on paper that looked more like artworks than assignments. After high school, she pursued fine arts at Somerset University. She thrived in those years, working part-time at the National Library, surrounded by the silence of books and the whispers of old paper. But Sarah was not content with the familiar. She had wanderlust in her veins. It was during this restless phase that she traveled to Mexico and enrolled at the Autonomous University of Puebla, where she studied humanities. Her classmates described her as the kind of girl who could talk to anyone anywhere and make them feel like they'd known her for years. Sarah laughed easily, spoke with warmth, and carried herself with the rare confidence of someone who had no reason to doubt the goodness of others. When she eventually returned home to Ashford, she decided to give back to the world through teaching. She worked with children, finding joy in their curiosity. By late 2018, she was hired as a substitute teacher at St. Mary's School in the northern part of the city. She quickly won the admiration of her students and the respect of her colleagues. She was the type of teacher children would talk about at home, the type that parents trusted. That December, Sarah received an offer to teach at another institution, Westbrook Academy, located in the town of Norfield. It was an opportunity she couldn't refuse. On December 9, 2018, Sarah moved into a modest rental home on Cordova Street in the small town of Millhaven, about 60 miles from Norfield. The place wasn't much, just a small flat with peeling paint, creaky floors, and the smell of damp wood, but it was hers. She told her parents she'd make it warm and inviting in no time. Yet, as she settled in, something unsettled her. Her neighbor. Across the hall lived a man named Richard Moore. He was in his 50s, just a few years older than Sarah's father, but unlike Thomas Collins, Richard carried a heavy, unsettling presence. His eyes lingered too long. Whenever Sarah left the apartment, whether to shop, to drive to work, or even to take out the trash, Richard would appear. Sometimes by the door, sometimes by the window, always watching. Sarah brushed it off at first. Maybe he was just lonely, maybe he was curious. But soon, the staring became too consistent, too heavy, and too deliberate to ignore. It made her skin crawl. On December 12th, Sarah went about her day as usual. She taught at Westbrook Academy, smiling at her students, reminding them of their assignments and laughing at their innocent jokes. Yet even in the middle of her day, she couldn't shake the thought of her neighbor's piercing eyes. As she pulled up to her home that evening in her small blue hatchback, she saw him again, Richard, standing outside watching. Disturbed, she texted her boyfriend, Daniel Jameson. "He's staring again. Every time I come home, he's there." Daniel replied quickly but with little comfort. "He was at work, unable to leave. Ignore him, love. He's probably harmless." But Sarah knew something was wrong. She replied, "I'll go for a walk. Don't want to sit here with him outside." At 4:20 p.m., another message from Sarah came in. She said she wasn't sure whether she would actually go because of the heavy winds. But then she did step out. She walked through the chilly air, went to the supermarket, bought a few groceries, and returned home. After that, silence. She never contacted her family again. The next morning, when Sarah failed to show up for work, concern quickly spread. Her colleague, the one who had helped her find the house, tried calling her. No answer. Alarmed, she contacted the local authorities. At the same time, Sarah's father, Thomas, called the police in Ashford to file a missing persons report. Later that evening, officers arrived at the house on Cordova Street. With a key from the landlady, they entered. The flat looked ordinary, no broken locks, no scattered belongings, no signs of a struggle. Nothing. But as the officers searched, Richard Moore stepped out of his apartment across the hall. He carried a basket and a folded blanket. When asked about Sarah, he shrugged. "I don't know her. Hardly ever talk to anyone here. Keep to myself." His voice was calm, but his eyes flickered, his hands restless. The officers exchanged glances. Something about him didn't sit right. Still, they had no evidence. He was free to leave. That night at the station, the officers decided to run his background. The results chilled them. Richard Moore had an extensive criminal record: burglary, assault, violence, prison time. He was no ordinary neighbor. He was dangerous. And Sarah Collins, the bright, kind, beloved young teacher, had vanished without a trace. The shadow over Millhaven was only beginning to spread. The Collins family never imagined their daughter would simply vanish. For them, Sarah was the responsible one, the strong one, the girl who could handle herself in almost any situation. But when her calls stopped, when her phone went unanswered, and when the hours turned into a full day of silence, their confidence collapsed into fear. By December 13th, the police had begun a full investigation. Officers scoured Sarah's modest rental home again, this time searching more carefully. They checked under the bed, inside the cupboards, behind the curtains. Everything was neat. Her clothes were folded in drawers, her books stacked neatly on a shelf, and the groceries she had bought the previous evening were sitting untouched in the kitchen. But something else was missing: Sarah herself, along with her phone, her keys, and a pair of sneakers. The officers kept returning to the same question: where could she have gone? Standing across the hall, Richard Moore watched the activity with an unreadable expression. When approached again, he repeated his earlier story. "I don't know her. Don't even know who lives there. I keep to myself." His words were smooth, almost rehearsed. But the officers noticed small details: the way he avoided direct eye contact, how his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the blanket he was carrying, how his voice tightened at certain questions. He was lying. They felt it. When his criminal record came back, the picture became clearer. Richard wasn't just a troubled man, he was a man with a violent past. Richard Moore had been born in the late 1960s in a small industrial town. He had a twin brother, David, and together they were inseparable and dangerous. From a young age, the boys were known for cruelty. Teachers remembered them as bullies who played cruel pranks, sometimes crossing the line into real harm. When they were just 10 years old, they had set fire to a classroom, watching with cold fascination as the flames spread. That cruelty never left Richard. It only grew darker. By the time he was 22, Richard was deep into drugs. He spent his nights prowling streets, looking for trouble, looking for a thrill. Property crimes, violent robberies, assaults, it was all part of his life. At 30, he crossed a line from which there was no return. In 1995, he was awaiting trial for a violent home invasion. One of the witnesses against him was an elderly woman named Cecilia. Fearing her testimony, Richard broke into her home one December night. He hid inside, waiting for her to return. When she entered her bedroom, he struck. He attacked with a knife, stabbing her 6 times in the neck. Cecilia died instantly. But instead of freedom, the murder brought him down. The civil guard caught him within weeks. In 1997, Richard was convicted of murder and obstruction of justice, adding to his already heavy criminal record. He was sentenced to 17 years in prison. Inside, he became a model prisoner. Quiet, obedient, respectful. He played the role well. Guards believed he was rehabilitated. But when Richard was granted a temporary leave in 2008, he showed his true face again. He attacked a young woman walking her dog, stabbing her. She barely survived. A year later, in 2009, Richard was given another temporary leave. This time, he didn't return. He vanished, evading authorities for nearly 10 months before surrendering himself, only to add more time to his sentence. By 2018, Richard was finally released. He had served his time, at least on paper. But the years behind bars had not cleansed him. They had sharpened him. He returned to society like a wolf released back into the wild, hungrier than ever. And fate had placed him directly across the hall from Sarah Collins. The police now had every reason to believe Richard was involved. But without evidence, suspicion wasn't enough. They needed proof. So they watched him. An undercover operation began. Officers parked near Cordova Street, pretending to monitor Sarah's apartment but in truth keeping their eyes locked on Richard Moore. They didn't want him to know he was the focus. They didn't want the neighbors gossiping. Silence was their strategy. But Richard wasn't a fool. He noticed the way cars lingered on the corner, the way unfamiliar men passed by his building too often. He could feel the invisible eyes, and paranoia began to eat at him. On the night of December 13th, just one day after Sarah's disappearance, Richard bolted. He fled his apartment, vanishing into the night. A neighbor saw him leave and alerted the police, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. The town of Millhaven began to whisper. The cheerful young teacher who had barely begun her life had vanished, and the strange man across the hall was suddenly missing. parents at the school where Sarah worked clutched their children tighter. People avoided walking down Cordova Street. And behind the scenes, detectives knew they were racing against time. Because men like Richard Moore didn't just stop. And if Sarah was still alive somewhere, every passing hour meant hope was fading. The morning after Richard Moore fled his apartment, the air in Millhaven was heavier than ever. The town's silence felt different now, not the calm of a small community, but the tension of people holding their breath, waiting for the worst. News of Sarah's disappearance had spread, and whispers turned into rumors. Some said she had run away. Others said she was abducted. But everyone mentioned Richard Moore's name. Detectives no longer treated Sarah's case as a simple missing person report. It had shifted into a full-scale criminal investigation. On December 14th, officers widened their search. They knocked on doors, questioned neighbors, and combed through Sarah's short digital trail. Her last known message had been at 4:20 p.m. on the day she vanished. After that, nothing. No calls, no texts, no social media activity. It was as if she had been erased. For investigators, one detail stood out. When they re-entered Sarah's apartment with her father and boyfriend, Daniel Jameson, they noticed items missing. Her sneakers, a pair of pants, her phone, and her keys. The absence of these personal belongings was unsettling. It suggested she hadn't just vanished. Someone had taken her, or forced her to leave. Meanwhile, Richard was on the move. Surveillance footage captured his black Alfa Romeo driving through nearby towns. The car appeared at his father's house. Then at a relative's. He was circling, restless, unpredictable. Each sighting fueled the urgency of the case. But Sarah's family was living a nightmare. Margaret Collins clutched her daughter's scarf as if holding it would keep Sarah close. Violet cried silently in the corner of the living room, while Andrew punched walls in helpless rage. Thomas Collins, though outwardly stoic, was a man unraveling inside. The police could see it in his eyes, desperation mixed with quiet dread. By December 15th, the investigation took a vital turn. Using Sarah's phone data, specialists tracked her last geolocation. The signal placed her near her home on the afternoon of December 12th. The final ping was picked up at 9 p.m. by a tower near Millhaven. But that didn't fit the narrative. Why would her phone signal appear hours after she had already gone missing? The search expanded into a 5-kilometer radius. Helicopters flew overhead, their blades chopping through the winter air. Dogs sniffed through thick underbrush. Volunteers, police officers, and locals walked in long lines, scouring the land for any sign of Sarah. They searched wells, abandoned barns, wooded areas, anywhere a body might be hidden. That afternoon, officers stumbled across Richard's black Alfa Romeo parked at his father's property. To them, the car wasn't just a vehicle. It was a coffin on wheels, a possible crime scene, a silent witness. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. On December 16th, the search radius widened to 10 kilometers. Hundreds of people joined in, moving through fields and woods with grim determination. Unbeknownst to them, they passed within just meters of Sarah's body. But they didn't see her. She remained hidden, silent, waiting to be discovered. The next morning, a volunteer spotted something unusual in a field. Clothes, torn, dirt-stained, and scattered as if discarded in haste. Among them, a pair of sneakers. Just 200 meters away lay the body of Sarah Collins. She was half naked, her skin pale against the cold ground. Bruises marked her arms and legs, signs of struggle. The violence was undeniable. A tattoo on her torso confirmed her identity. Sarah was gone. The news ripped through Millhaven like a scream in the night. Her parents collapsed when officers arrived at their door. Daniel Jameson punched the wall until his knuckles bled. The town fell into mourning. But for detectives, grief transformed instantly into resolve. They knew now they weren't searching for a missing woman. They were hunting a killer. And Richard Moore had just become the most wanted man in the country. The discovery of Sarah Collins' body changed everything. What had been a desperate search for a missing young woman was now a murder investigation. And Millhaven, once a quiet town, had transformed into a pressure cooker of grief, fear, and rage. The Collins family home was draped in silence. Margaret could not let go of Sarah's scarf, now soaked with her tears. Violet had stopped speaking altogether, her silence a haunting presence in the house. Thomas Collins tried to remain strong, but at night he would retreat into the garage, where he could break down in solitude. Only Andrew's anger remained loud, his fists slamming against walls, his voice echoing curses into the night. Detectives, meanwhile, were focused on Richard Moore. His absence spoke volumes. He hadn't attended Sarah's funeral. He hadn't reached out to her family. He hadn't even returned to collect his belongings. He was gone, vanished into the shadows. But the evidence left behind whispered his name. The black Alfa Romeo was processed carefully, every inch photographed and dusted for prints. Forensic experts found Sarah's blood smeared along the interior, her hair tangled in the fabric of the seats. It was a mobile crime scene, and Richard had been careless enough to leave behind the truth. On December 17th, an arrest warrant was issued. Richard Moore, once a promising young man with a bright career ahead, was now a fugitive wanted for murder. News channels erupted with the story. His face was plastered across every screen, every headline. Commentators dissected his behavior, analyzing his childhood, his relationships, his supposed double life. Some neighbors described him as polite, quiet, intelligent. Others whispered that he had always been manipulative, that Sarah had looked unhappy in his presence. The town split into factions. Some people clung to the belief that Richard was innocent, a scapegoat in a case full of assumptions. Others were convinced he was a predator who had finally revealed his true nature. But whether innocent or guilty, one fact remained undeniable. Richard had disappeared and Sarah was dead. By December 18th, police extended their manhunt beyond Millhaven. Roadblocks were set up on highways. Richard's bank accounts were frozen. His last phone signal was traced near the countryside, but after that, he went dark. He left no trail of credit card transactions, no digital footprint. It was as if he had rehearsed his vanishing act. But the truth was simpler. Richard wasn't clever, he was desperate. Witnesses came forward saying they'd seen him wandering rural areas, thin and disheveled, always looking over his shoulder. He had shaved his beard, cut his hair, and was living on scraps, trying to stay one step ahead of the law. Meanwhile, Sarah's funeral was held on December 20th. Hundreds gathered, the church overflowing with mourners carrying flowers and candles. Her coffin, white with gold trim, was lowered into the ground while her mother wailed in grief. Daniel Jameson stood silently at the grave, his face pale, his fists clenched. Detectives attended too, not to mourn but to watch. They scanned the crowd, half expecting Richard to appear, unable to resist the pull of guilt or arrogance. But he didn't. His absence confirmed what everyone already knew. By the end of the month, posters of Richard Moore's face were plastered across the region, wanted for the murder of Sarah Collins. His name became synonymous with betrayal and brutality. Parents warned their children about men like him. Strangers spat at his picture. His family, too, withdrew into silence, shunned by association. The hunt was no longer just about justice. It was about restoring peace to a town that had been poisoned by fear. But what the police didn't know was that Richard Moore was watching them too. From safe houses, abandoned sheds, and remote barns, he followed the coverage of Sarah's murder on stolen radios and newspapers left behind at bus stops. He read about himself like a ghost reading his own obituary. And the longer he stayed hidden, the more dangerous he became. Winter settled heavily over Millhaven, wrapping the countryside in a suffocating silence. Snow blanketed the roads and rooftops, muffling every sound except the howl of the wind. For most families, it was the season of warm fires and shared meals. But for Richard Moore, it was a season of shadows, hunger, and fear. He had been on the run for nearly 3 weeks. His once clean clothes were now torn and caked with dirt. His shoes, once polished leather, had split open at the seams. He looked nothing like the young man who had charmed Sarah Collins. He was now a gaunt figure, his face pale and hollow, his eyes wild with exhaustion. Richard had underestimated what it meant to disappear. Movies made it look easy: burn the ID, cut your hair, vanish into the crowd. But reality was cruel. Every gas station attendant seemed to stare too long. Every stranger's glance carried suspicion. Every passing police car sent his heart racing. He couldn't sleep. At night, when he lay curled up in barns or abandoned cabins, he would hear Sarah's voice. Sometimes she called his name softly like she used to. Other times, she screamed, her cries echoing in his skull until he jolted awake, drenched in sweat. He couldn't escape her, not in daylight, not in dreams. Meanwhile, detectives were tightening their net. The manhunt had expanded to neighboring states. Officers combed through forests, barns, and truck stops, searching for the fugitive who had become a national obsession. His face, pale and nervous, stared out from every news broadcast, every newspaper, every highway poster. Richard tried to stay one step ahead. He stole food from convenience stores, raided dumpsters behind diners, and slipped onto freight trains when no one was looking. Each theft, each trespass, made him sink further into the life of an animal. He had become a ghost haunting the edges of society. But paranoia was his worst enemy. On one occasion he spotted a police cruiser at a gas station. Convinced they had recognized him, he bolted into the woods, running until his legs gave out. He collapsed in the snow, gasping for air, waiting for the gunshots that never came. When he finally realized he was alone, he laughed hysterically, a sound broken and unhinged. In Millhaven, Sarah's family endured their own torment. Margaret often sat by the window waiting for news, her grief transforming into an unshakable obsession. Andrew, restless and bitter, swore he would hunt Richard himself if the police couldn't. Violet remained quiet, but her silence had become sharp, like glass. Each look she gave was filled with something darker than sorrow. Detectives knew Richard was losing control. "Men like him always slip up," one investigator said grimly. "He'll either turn himself in, or he'll self-destruct." They were right. Richard's mask of control was crumbling. One night, desperate and starving, he broke into a farmhouse. He thought it was empty, but an old man awoke to the sound of shattering glass. Their eyes met in the dark, the fugitive and the innocent. For a moment, Richard considered killing him just to keep the silence. His hands trembled as he held a knife stolen from the kitchen. But then something inside him cracked. He dropped the blade and fled into the night, sobbing like a child. Richard knew he couldn't run forever. His body was weak, his mind fractured, and his guilt a constant weight. But he also knew that surrender meant death, not by the law but by the world that had already convicted him. As the days stretched into January, whispers spread across Millhaven, sightings of Richard in gas stations, diners, truck stops. But no one could catch him. He was both everywhere and nowhere, a shadow slipping just out of reach. And then, in a moment of madness, Richard made a mistake. The kind of mistake that would shatter the illusion of safety he had built around himself. The net was closing. Snow still clung to the streets of Millhaven when the town awoke to news that would change everything. After weeks of evasion, weeks of whispers and false sightings, Richard Moore had finally made his mistake. It began in a roadside diner 20 miles from town. Exhausted and delirious, Richard staggered inside, his beard unkempt, his clothes tattered. He ordered coffee, but when the waitress asked for payment, he froze. He had no money left. His hands trembled as he muttered excuses, but the waitress had already recognized him. The haunted eyes, the sunken cheeks, she had seen his face on every broadcast. She retreated to the back, pretending to fetch sugar. In reality, she was dialing the sheriff's office. Richard, sensing the danger, bolted from the diner, his heart slamming against his ribs. He ran into the icy night, snow crunching beneath his boots, but the net was already tightening. By dawn, dozens of officers combed the countryside. Helicopters thundered overhead. Bloodhounds picked up his scent. For the first time, Richard realized the chase was truly over. His legs were failing him, his breath shallow, his body ravaged by hunger. He stumbled into the woods, every step heavier than the last. As he collapsed against a tree, his mind betrayed him once more. He saw Sarah Collins standing before him, her face pale but her eyes burning with something fierce. She said nothing, she only looked at him, and that gaze was enough. Richard screamed into the empty forest, clawing at the snow as if he could bury her memory. But she would not leave him. The hunt ended at an abandoned cabin near the river. Richard had forced his way inside, shivering and delirious. Officers surrounded the place by nightfall, their guns trained on the rotting walls. The sheriff raised a megaphone, his voice steady. "Richard Moore. Come out with your hands up." Inside, Richard laughed. It was not the laugh of a man in control, but of one who had lost everything. He stumbled to the window, his shadow visible to the men outside. For a moment, he considered surrender. For a moment, he thought of walking into the cold night with his hands raised, to let it all end quietly. But pride, or madness, stopped him. Instead, he clutched the kitchen knife he had carried for weeks, his last weapon, his last shred of defiance. The standoff stretched for hours. Negotiators pleaded. Helicopter lights swept over the trees. Reporters gathered at the perimeter, their cameras aimed at the dark cabin where a broken man clung to his final hours. Then, just before dawn had ended, a single gunshot rang out from inside. The officers stormed the cabin, only to find Richard Moore slumped on the floor, the knife by his side, blood seeping into the wooden boards. Whether it was his own hand or the chaos of the raid, no one could say for certain. But one truth was undeniable: his run was over. Millhaven exhaled. The nightmare that had begun with Sarah's disappearance had finally reached its grim conclusion. Yet closure did not come easily. For Sarah's family, the loss remained a wound that would never heal. Margaret wept silently at the window. Andrew cursed the cruelty of fate. Violet's silence deepened into something unspoken, something the others could never quite name. In the town square, Richard's wanted posters were torn down. His name was etched into the town's history, not as the charming young man he once pretended to be, but as the shadow who destroyed lives and ran until he could run no more. But legends have a way of lingering. Some swore they still saw him on lonely roads, his ghost wandering in the snow. Others whispered that his laughter echoed through the woods where he fell. Millhaven, forever scarred, would never forget the boy who became a fugitive, and the girl who haunted him until the end. The story was over, but the darkness it left behind would never fade.